Good morning. It's a beautiful day in Manhattan, Kansas. It's been a beautiful spring. Welcome to the 79th Landon Lecture on Public Issues. Before introducing our very, very distinguished speaker, let me say good morning to and introduce Representative Jim Slattery, who's a great congressman in the 2nd District, good friend of public higher education, and a superb friend of Kansas State University. Jim Slattery, right here. Another important guest here today is Georgia Niece Gray, the first woman treasurer of the United States, 1948 to 52, and her husband, Andrew. Nice to see you both. Thank you for coming. Right down there. On the platform today and on your right, Dr. John Keller, Professor of Regional and Community Planning and President of the Faculty Senate. Let's give a big hand to John Keller. Next to him, we have a junior in business administration and the president of the Kansas State University student body, Troy Lubers. Troy? On your left, Ed Seaton, publisher of the Manhattan Mercury and chairman of the Landon Patrons. Ed Seaton. And then next to him, my assistant and chairman of the Landon Lecture Series, Dr. Charles Reagan. Well, I'm very pleased today to introduce the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, Jim Wright of Texas. He is one of only 15 persons to preside over the House of Representatives in this century, and he's now presiding over the historic 100th Congress. As you know, the Speaker of the House of Representatives is one of the most important and powerful positions in the United States government, and he is second in the line of succession after the Vice President. Congressman Wright was born in Fort Worth, Texas, the city he now represents in the Congress. He finished public school in only 10 years and was well on his way to a college degree when the United States entered the Second World War. Mr. Wright enlisted in the Army Air Corps and received his wings and commission when he was 19. He flew combat missions in the South Pacific and holds the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Legion of Merit. Well, if you can believe this, at the age of 23, he was elected to the Texas legislature. At 31, he was elected to the United States Congress. He is presently serving his 17th, can you imagine that, Jim Slattery, 17th consecutive term? He was majority leader of the House, I'm sure, as most of the people here know, for 10 years. On January 6, 1987, Jim Wright was sworn in as Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. He has been an author of major legislation in the fields of foreign affairs, economic development, water conservation, education, and energy. He has written 4 books and many articles for magazines and newspapers throughout the country. Well, it is a great honor for Kansas State University to have here the United States House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, Jim Wright. Jim, God bless you and welcome to Kansas State.
Beautiful. What a warm and wonderful welcome. Such an introduction as that, given to me by your president, reminds me of a comment of the late Hubert Humphrey. He said there are only 2 kinds of people in the whole world who appreciate flattery. It's men and women. That's all. Undeserved though it is, I thank you. I'm impressed with the number of people here. A nice turnout for the Landon Lecture Series. I'll try to avoid the same mistake that one of our colleagues made when he found himself in Indiana before a much larger audience than he had anticipated. he began his remarks with his most oratorical flourish, saying, "It thrills my heart and delights the innermost recesses of my soul to see such a dense crowd gathered here today." Well, I know that you aren't dense, because many of you come from this great area that had the good common sense to elect my colleague Jim Slattery, and that means you've got smarts. Unlike many people in this audience, I did not have the privilege to know Governor Alfred M. Landon. I did come to admire him for his integrity and his intelligence, his never-failing good humor, and his good common sense. It is ironic, in a way, I think, that he is remembered throughout so much of the country as the unsuccessful candidate for president in a landslide election, or even that he is remembered primarily as the spokesman of one political party, because his legacy is so much broader than that for our country as a whole. Alf Landon called himself a progressive and a practical progressive. When he served as governor of this state, he championed a pay-as-we-go budget. God knows, something we could use in the United States today, and something that Jim Slattery, your Congressman Jim Slattery, as a member of the House Budget Committee, has worked arduously and diligently to try to bring about. Alf Landon also proposed the graduated income tax, a mark of eminent fairness. He proposed a Farm Mortgage Moratorium Act, and that again, throughout this great heartland of America, is a topical problem. And so many of our farms and farm homes are being foreclosed and gates swinging to on rusty hinges. In his 1936 book, Alf Landon coined a new phrase, the new frontier. And for more than a generation, the phrase languished and nobody discovered it and picked it up, until a full generation later it became the rallying cry for a generation of Democrats under the leadership of John F. Kennedy. He was that kind of man. He had the vision in 1966, at the very first of these series in the Landon Lecture Series, to recommend that it would be in our best interest if we were to open diplomatic relations and create a détente and understanding with mainland China, and to open up those clogged arteries of trade and commerce and cultural exchange that so long had been shut off as impermeably as the Great Wall of China in its day had shut things off. He was before his time then. Other politicians didn't dare to say that for fear of being charged with being soft on communism or something of that sort. But Alf Landon, with the vision of the pure-hearted, had the ability and the courage to say what he thought. And since that time, it has come about, of course, under the leadership of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon primarily. And because of that, both countries have flourished, and it's been to our mutual benefit. He had vision. He had that quality of which Solomon said, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." And so I want to talk today about vision. I want to ask about the future. I want us to think of the future of the United States. Sometimes it's good just to pause and take stock, take inventory, see what we have, where we are, and where we're going. Ever since a man named Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage, men have been guilty of underestimating the value of their heritage, selling out too cheaply. The original discoverer of the fabulous Hope Diamond was an obscure British trader and trapper in North Africa who sold it for 6 British pounds, then the equivalent of about $24, because he was just grossly incapable of estimating the value of what he held in his hand. $24, coincidentally enough, the same sum for which the Indians sold Manhattan Island. $24 and some poorly distilled whiskey. $24 and a hangover. For Manhattan Island, where today footage on most of the streets leases for upwards of $2,400 a running foot. Lest we be guilty of that same sin of under-evaluating the heritage that we have here in this richly endowed land of ours and where we're going, let's just stop and pause and think about it a little bit, the good and the bad. I assure you that I don't have any idea that I shall talk all this period. I want most of the time to be for questions and answers, if we can do that. I'd like for you to have a chance to have a colloquy and a conversation. Somebody said too many political figures spend all of their time answering questions nobody's asking in the first place. And I think that's possibly true. But we are asking questions. We are asking questions, I know all of us, about the future of the United States. In Washington, we are reading a book. Three of us, just before we came in, acknowledged that all three of us are in the process of reading this book. It's a huge, big tome. I recommend it to you if you've got time and serious interest in the future, and the future of this country particularly. It's a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers by a professor at Yale named Paul Kennedy. He spins out this scenario going back over the period of the Habsburgs and the British of the Victorian realm and all the great empires that have risen and waned, and he makes a case that there is an almost irresistible temptation on the part of a power when it becomes influential in the world and powerful and rich to overextend itself. He calls it imperial overreach, to become so fascinated with the trappings of world power, you see, that it wants to assert itself and wield its influence on world events, and begins to neglect the infrastructure at home and the basic needs of the fundamental social structure at home and the people at home, and in so doing finally gets into trouble abroad and gets into debt at home and sinks into a morass of mediocrity. Now, is that inevitable? Well, I'm going to argue it's not inevitable. I think it has to happen. It does not necessarily become our destiny just because it has been the destiny of other nations, other civilizations. They've strutted across the stage of world leadership only to fade and wane, their brief, bright promise unfulfilled. We don't have to do that. We can do differently. And so I want to suggest to you that ours is a country that ever since its beginning has had what we call the American dream. We've been a little different from other countries. We were different essentially from those countries of Europe who believed that they could endow an aristocratic group with enough learning and enough education that they could look after things for the rest of us. We didn't believe that. We believed that our destiny was to spread the rights of learning as broadly as possible, to spread ownership as broadly as possible, to have a kind of a people's capitalism in which the people themselves were able to own their own homes, literally, step by step. Oh, we didn't come to this overnight, but over the years and over the generations we have come to it. John Adams put it pretty well. John Adams, in the torchlight of the American Revolution, said, "I must study politics and war in order that my sons may study mathematics and philosophy, in order that their children may have the liberty to study painting and poetry and music." Now, that set a theme for what has come to be called the American dream. It's been the idea that each generation ought to do a little bit better than the one before. And yet now we have come in this decade upon a new phenomenon, not rising expectations, not the phenomenon of upward mobility, which has been our goal and has characterized our country from the beginning, but a new phenomenon of downward mobility, which I think is unacceptable to us. As a matter of plain fact, today, in this decade, where we have doubled what we've spent on military things and extended our reach throughout the world, and to tell you the truth, I voted for most of those things. I have voted for increases in military expenditures because I didn't want to put us at the mercy of countries that would have no mercy. But the truth of it is that we have neglected things at home, and we've reached the point where today the average 30-year-old couple finds it harder, not easier, to buy and own a home than that couple's counterpart, older brothers and sisters, did 10 or 12 years ago. And that's not good enough for America. You find a situation today in which the average 40-year-old couple struggling to save enough money to send the kids to college finds it harder, not easier, than it was 10 or 15 years ago for the 40-year-old couple to save up enough to send their kids to college. That's not good enough, in my view, for America. So this past week in the Congress, we have been looking at the trade bill. We passed that trade bill by a little better than 3 to 1, or about 3 to 1 in the House just this last Thursday. It bodes well to become law. It's the result of 3 years of arduous work on the part of 12 committees of the House and a number of the committees of the Senate, and then many months of hammering out on anvils of mutual compromise a conference committee report that melded the best of both House and Senate versions. And now we had the conference committee report and we passed it about 3-1. I earnestly hope that it is not vetoed. I hope the President will reconsider his objection to one minor provision in the bill, minor in the scope of the whole almost 1,000-page bill, and will sign it. It's an important thing that we do because we're saying by means of this trade bill that we're not going to accept mediocrity, that we're not ready to allow this country to lose its competitiveness in world markets, and that we're not ready for America's future to be behind us, that we think our future is ahead of us. And yet we've got some staggering obstacles to overcome. Our trade deficit has grown each year for the past 6 years. Until last year, we suffered the biggest trade deficit any country ever suffered in the entire history of the human race, $170-some-odd billion. The United States years before this had begun to suffer a deficit in such big things as automobiles and steel, but this last year, for the first time, we suffered a deficit in those things in which we had majored: high-tech information industry goods, computers and telecommunications equipment and business machines. We suffered a deficit in them this past year. In the past 5 years, our country has sunk from being the world's biggest creditor nation, a nation to which other countries owed more money than was owed to any other country in the world, until today we're the world's biggest debtor nation. I'm not just talking about the national debt, though that's a staggering figure in its own right. I'm talking about the debts that we owe to foreigners. And we owe more than Brazil owes, owe more than Mexico owes, owe more than any other country of the world, because we have tolerated this trade deficit and allowed it to grow so inexorably and so rapidly over these past 5 years. Last year, the United States sank from first in gross national product, per capita gross national product, to third. We aren't even second anymore. And that happened last year. In just these last few years, foreign ownership of American assets has more than doubled, from $700 billion in 1983 to $1.5 trillion in 1987. And today, nearly 21% of the assets of American banks are owned by foreigners. Last year, the two biggest exports from our largest port, the Port of New York and New Jersey, were scrap metal, mostly from junked automobiles, and waste paper. And the waste paper is sent to Oriental countries which remake it into corrugated boxes and things like that that they use to send goods to our markets. And so the top legislative priority before our Congress, trying to serve this American nation and our future, has been the passage of this omnibus trade bill. It's a comprehensive bill, but it can be boiled down, I think, to 3 words. And I want to give you just a little feel for what it is we're trying to do: the rules and the tools and the schools to make us number one again. Let me mention the rules just briefly. We're asking in this bill that the rules of international trade provide a level playing field. Free trade, yes, absolutely. Fair trade. We're asking only that other countries treat our goods on their markets just exactly the same way we treat their goods on our markets, no better and no worse, and we think we've got a right to ask that. We are suggesting that the time has come now that all the nations of the world that engage in trade must respect the products of one another and not use them as battering rams to tear down the economies of one another. Let's go back just a few years. We opened our arms and we opened our ports to the products that they would make and send to us. And we looked the other way, frankly, when they built little umbrellas of protection over their infant industries and systematically began to exclude the goods that the United States was shipping to them, because we thought, well, it's all right. That doesn't amount to much of our market. Let's let them get a good start, and therefore they won't be quite so vulnerable to the blandishments of communism and other isms that are rampant in the world, and they can build their own strong economies and then be politically stable once they build their strong economies. That made good sense. But time passed, and those countries are no longer developing countries. They're highly developed countries. And today a great many of them are using our market as a dumping ground and their goods as a battering ram for entry into our markets. What they're doing is that they are selling goods that they make on our markets cheaper than they'll sell them to their own people on their own markets as a device of breaking some of our manufacturers, and then they can get the whole market, they think. And while they're doing that, they are systematically excluding American goods from some of their markets. To give you just a few illustrations, in some cases it's creative red tape. It's just deliberate long-term red tape where if one of the American manufacturers applies for a permit to send goods to one of the markets abroad, that permit will be processed indefinitely, continuously, voluminously, and nothing ever gets done. It's never proved. Or in another case that was told to me a few days ago by Lee Iacocca, in one instance we sent a shipload of 200 American-made automobiles that finally, after a certain amount of badgering, were permitted into the market. But the ship was unloaded once it landed at the dock, one car a day. Or in another instance, the requirement was made that any American goods of a certain type, if sold on their market, had to be advertised in English. How many Toyotas you reckon we'd be buying if they had to be advertised in Japanese, you know? And so in response to this kind of thing, the thing that we have found so hurtful to us, we have asked that other countries that trade with us and that want to claim freedom of our markets simply must do exactly that and give us freedom on their markets. The rules, a new set of rules. Fairness. Second thing is that it provides the tools that will try to help make us competitive again. It tries to stimulate investment in the modernizing those aging industrial plants and machinery in the United States that have become outmoded to the end that we improve our productivity and that we improve our competitive stature and we put a keen edge on American competition again. It provides a new incentive for investment in America, in building America. You know, the investment rate in the United States is the second lowest in all the industrialized world, and that's a darn shame. Shouldn't be. Wasn't 12 years ago. It is today. Last year, Japan invested 2.8% of its total gross national product in non-defense research and development, and to find new methodologies, new technologies, new products. 2.8%, in Germany 2.6%, United States only 1.9%. And a recent poll of West Germans found that only 6% of them considered the tag made in the USA to be indicative of quality today. Now we can do better than that. We must do better than that. And this bill that we just passed in the House and that they'll pass in the Senate, I predict, on Tuesday, establishes a National Institute of Technology to help particularly small businesses find ways to convert new discoveries and new inventions into marketable products that we can sell abroad. And it strengthens and beefs up the foreign commercial service so that when we do try to sell on foreign markets, we will have somebody in every American embassy whose main job it is to go out and try to help market the sale of American-made goods so that there continue to be products, opportunities, jobs for people here in the United States to turn out those goods. And it provides improved financing opportunities for individuals who want to sell on foreign markets, just as foreign countries provide financing for people who want to sell on our market. It makes us more competitive. It provides the tools to make us competitive again in world commerce. And finally, the schools. Maybe this is the most important part of what we're trying to do. We have allowed ourselves, unfortunately, to lag behind in the greatest goal of all, and that's quality education. Let me just give you a couple of illustrations. Last year, we graduated from American colleges and universities about 54,000 young Americans with mathematical and scientific and engineering disciplines. 54,000. And Japan, with just half our population, was graduating 77,000, half again as many more. Look at it another way. Japan has in the United States some 10,000 business representatives selling Japanese goods on the American market. All of them speak excellent English. And we, by comparison, have only about 500 people representing American businesses in the Japanese market, and hardly any of them speak Japanese. You see what I'm saying? We ignore education. It shouldn't be any wonder to us why we fall behind in trade. Unfortunately, American students do not do as well in math and science and several of the other technical subjects, and certainly not in foreign languages, as the students from each of the other industrialized countries are doing today. 13% of American adults are functionally illiterate, as compared with only 2% in Japan. Now, you see, I don't want to keep bringing up Japan. I can bring up West Germany. I can bring up a number of other countries. That just happens to make the most dramatic difference. And that's not our destiny. You know, we don't need to settle for second best. It's not necessary for us to do that. So we passed this bill, strengthening job training, strengthening vocational training opportunities of every kind, trying to make it easier for Americans to go to college. You know what I think the very best investment this country ever made? Well, maybe the example of the Louisiana Purchase may have been better. That was before my time. I'm not really quite that old, in spite of the fact that I've been there all these terms, as the President has told you. I think the best investment I know anything about in our time, in my time, was the GI Bill of Rights at the end of World War II. Made it possible for an entire generation of young Americans, my generation, to get a college education. Has it cost us? No, it's made money for us. It's been the best investment in cold cash dollars and cents that we've ever made, because it allowed people to have higher earning power as a result of the education they got, and because of that higher earning power, they paid back more in extra taxes to the government of the United States by a quotient of 25 or 30 to 1 for every dollar we spent making it possible for them to get an education. And so those are the things I think that we must do. The United States' efforts to retrain displaced workers have been hampered by the fact that 73% of the white-collar workers and 80% of the blue-collar workers get less than 30 days' notice if they're going to be thrown out of work, and they don't have the time or the opportunity to look around and try to enlist in a new technology if the skills for which they've been trained are no longer useful on the marketplace. And so this bill authorizes those funds to strengthen and beef up our education, and we think it's a great bill, and we urge you to be supportive of it. It's the first step. The next step is really to strengthen quality education for all of America's students, all of America's children, and all of America's future. You know, it disturbs me that I read recently a current opinion poll which reports that Americans, for the first time in the history of this country, are saying that they expect their children to have a lesser standard of living than they themselves have enjoyed. Now, that expectation is just fundamentally contrary to the basic spirit of America. It's unworthy of us. It's negativism. We just must not be satisfied with that. As a nation, we're as big as our dreams. We're as strong as our faith. America doesn't have to settle for just fare. We never have. We shouldn't now. We do not have to accept shoddy workmanship as a norm, prevalence of drugs in our society, rising crime rates, falling standard of living, less public civility. Those are not the norms of American behavior. We don't have to settle for that. We do not have to accept budget deficits and trade deficits as unavoidable and inevitable. These do not add up to an acceptable national self-image. We can do better. We have done better than that. We can do a lot better than that. Mediocrity is not our destiny. We don't have to be satisfied with that. Together we can build a better future, and we can make it come to pass. That's my message to you today. I see an America resurgent in world commerce, where made in the USA once again is a badge of quality and value throughout the world. We can do it. I see an America renewed in spirit and dedicated to the goal of quality education, where the humblest child of this land will have as his or her birthright, a right to an educational opportunity equal to that reserved for aristocracy in other countries. I see an America in which the dream of home ownership is a living reality for every young couple that wants a home. I see an America in which there is a useful job for every citizen who's willing to work. No, no, not the idea that the country owes me a living. No, sir, not that the government owes everybody a living. No. But that a nation as beneficently endowed as ours has been does owe to the humblest one of us a real opportunity to earn a living. And you know something else? I see a possibility in America at peace. I believe we can achieve that. Last year, one of the television networks broadcast a documentary entitled The Face of the Enemy, and it demonstrated how we can create enemies in our own minds. We think negatively of other people, and we expect the worst of them, and we sort of build mental stereotypes that keep us ever from developing any degree of understanding between us. And both sides do this. Both sides think negatively of one another and reinforce those thoughts by our self-talk. Well, the result is that bad feelings are perpetuated, and peace is stifled in the cradle. I don't think it has to happen. It doesn't have to happen in Central America. It doesn't have to happen in our relationships with the Soviet Union. I had the privilege last year, in fact, a year ago this month, in leading a group to the Soviet Union official delegation. I saw great change there. We spent about 2 hours with Gorbachev and 2 hours with Mr. Ligachev and 2 hours with Mr. Shevardnadze. Now, I'm not trying to tell you the Soviet Union is a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's a dictatorship. Nobody you know would want to live there. It's not that. But it is changing, and for the first time, I saw a willingness on their part to acknowledge that they haven't created the workers' paradise and that they've got some problems. And Gorbachev put it this way. He said, look, you people rode on some of our best highways, and I guess you probably thought that these compare reasonably well with your own highways. I'm told that they do. But he said, you may not have noticed that beyond those highways in the lateral sectors, there aren't any paved roads. There are no farm roads. I understand that you people have paved farm-to-market roads where your farmers can bring their goods to markets. We don't have any of that. He said, we like to have it. He said, we like to be able to spend money on that kind of thing. We like to be able to spend money on creating medicines and finding ways to cure diseases and trying to find ways to improve our production of consumer goods if we didn't have to spend so much money on military hardware. Well, it made a certain amount of sense to me. You know, we have to agree with them about everything. I don't agree with them by any manner of means, but you don't have to agree with someone in order to be at peace. I don't know whether peace is possible, but I do believe, as a result of an experience that I had, that it is. While I was there, I was given the opportunity to speak to the Soviet people on television, nationwide television. I was told afterward by our State Department people that the time that was allotted to me, prime time, was the very time that was chosen by Gorbachev when he wanted to speak to the Soviet people himself. You know, when you got them out there listening, you don't have much competition. It's just one station. So I leaped at the opportunity. I said, now, look, I want to say what I want to say, and I hope you don't intend to cut me off. Oh, no, we're not going to cut you off. Say whatever you want to say. 15, 20 minutes, however long you want to talk, and then if you would, answer some questions. I said, fine. I spoke to them and said to them what I thought was a message of peace from our country, that we don't hate them. I said, you know, here we are, we're spending about $300 billion this year on weapons, and we're doing it because we're afraid of what you people would do to us if we didn't. That's why we're doing it. And I said, I suppose your country is spending about the same amount, maybe 200 billion rubles, which is about $300 billion. Perhaps it's for the reason that you're afraid of what you think we might do to you if you didn't. It wouldn't make a whole lot more sense if both of us mutually and verifiably could start reducing these weapons in a way that you can come and look, we come and look at yours, verifiable, mutual. Nobody gets an advantage, but each of us will have more money to spend feeding the hungry and clothing the naked and trying to find eradications for diseases and things of that kind, building libraries and schools and things that ennoble the human race. And then I said, if you feel this way, or if you don't feel this way, I'd like for you to write to me. And I was wearing a little lapel pin that the State Department given to each of us with crossed flags, the United States flag and the Soviet flag. And I said, if you write me a little letter, I'll send you one of these. 3,000 people from that sprawling country wrote me letters. Most of them were in Russian, and about a third of them were in English. The younger people were writing in English. They were young people, students. They were from young couples. They were from guys my age who had participated in World War II and remembered that experience. And as a result of that, I'm convinced, I don't know what the Soviet leaders say, that the plain people of that country want peace. And so I see a possibility of an America at peace. I also see an America renewed, an America composed not of the abstract and disconnected collection of self-centered individuals, each seeking his own aggrandizement, but rather a team. We can be a team whose members are reinforced by the inner strength of collective self-confidence and a genuine caring for one another. Many centuries ago, the philosopher Socrates was talking on the street in Athens with a friend named Glaucon. Socrates was describing his ideas of the ideal city. He called it the city of God. And finally his friend said, Socrates, I do not believe that any such city as you've described exists in heaven, and I don't think one ever will exist on earth. And Socrates replied, whether such a city as that exists in heaven or ever will exist on earth, I shall affix my eyes upon that city, having nothing to do with any other, and so doing, I will help to bring it about. Well, there's your sermon. That's the end of the commercial. Now, find out if you got any of the right questions to my answers or not. Who's first?
Well, we do have some time for questions and answers, so if you have your questions, if you could go down to the appropriate mic, and the speaker would be very happy to answer any of your questions.
Pardon me.
Should we start over
Speaker? My question is, why take the chance of losing this bill that is so great over such, what you say, a small, minor thing? Why not possibly delete or bargain down the 60-day? I believe that's the part of the bill that the president is not sure of or doesn't want. Why not work it out?
A lot of things were, in fact, moderated and modified in the bill in an effort to appease objections that were heard from people in the executive branch of government, and this one was itself watered down. The size of the plants, it applies only to the top 5% of companies in the United States, and we wrote a provision which says to the effect that if a company doesn't know that it's getting ready to close down a factory and take it out of that community and take it overseas and build it somewhere else, that it doesn't have to do it, but that if it does know 60 days in advance, that it ought to advise the employees so that they can put their lives together. And I think it was just a matter that was felt keenly by the conferees. I discussed it with them when I first heard that this might be the sticking point, cause veto. I talked with the chairman of the House Conferees group, and he said he would swab his members and see what they thought. And he reported back to me the next day that they just were adamant that they thought it was too important a matter from the standpoint of fairness. I guess you stop and think about it this way. Those of you to whom economic security would be important if you had a job, don't you suppose that you'd want to be given notice if your employer was going to close the factory so that you could kind of organize and put your life together and have a chance to overcome that emotional and economic hurdle that besets a family when the breadwinner is thrown suddenly out of work? And if you got 60 days notice in advance, as most of the big responsible companies do on their own, then a community has the opportunity to go out and try to find somebody to buy that plant. There was a case out in Utah where the U.S. Steel Company was going to close down a plant because it was just marginally profitable. It was making maybe 8% on the investment, and they didn't think that was enough. They could put a plant up somewhere else, maybe overseas, and make 15, 20%. And so they're going to close it down, but they gave 60 days notice. And the community rallied around and bought the plant, and it's operating today and operating successfully. And the community doesn't care if they don't make but 8%. It's important to that community. And so if you didn't have that advance notice, it had been gone, and the community wouldn't have had an opportunity to save it. So I think all those arguments entered into it in the minds of people on the conference and in the minds of members of Congress. We gave an opportunity for an amendment to be drawn, and it was offered. That would send it back to conference committee with instructions to take that particular thing out so as to please the President. But that was rejected, so a majority has spoken.
Speaker Wright.
It's a matter of fairness that we ask other countries to treat American goods the way we treat theirs. I don't think we can afford to see the steady erosion of America's industrial might, and I don't think we can afford to see American jobs just taken and sent overseas. And so that's what I think. Now, we've been trying to do this for 3 years. We passed a bill in the House 3 years ago, and it didn't get brought up in the Senate. And then last year we passed it on April 28th in the House. It wasn't an election year. It would have been pleasing to me if the Senate had been able to act immediately, and we got it passed last year. But you don't stop legislating every other year just because it's an election year. I think people expect us to continue to do those things that are good for America, whether it's an election year or not.
Speaker Wright.
Yes, sir.
I want to commend you for the effort that you have made toward peace in Central America.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask you about it. The truce which was signed, the temporary truce which was signed by the government of Nicaragua and by the Contras, provides for humanitarian aid if it is provided by a third party. This past week, the Nicaraguan government has accused the U.S. government of providing aid to the Contras through Honduras directly through the vehicle of USAID. Is that the fault of Congress for not having passed a bill which was consistent with that truce agreement and with the Central American Peace Plan, or is that a problem of the implementation by the executive branch?
Well,
the other question that I would ask is related to that, and
you want me to ask? Let me take a shot at the first one. You will. The farmer is not the case. The aid plan that we voted is consistent with the Arias Peace Plan, and it is consistent with the agreement. And I am not aware of the thing that you just reported to me. There may be some disagreement as to what is the proper agency, but we voted in the Congress to allow the aid agency to be the agency that carries it out. I thought that was better than having it done by the military. I thought it was better than having it done by the CIA. And so I don't know what other agency you got, you know. I mean, the aid agency is the one to do it. My view is that when they patch it all up down there and piece it together, we will be a part of a reconciliation effort, and I think we should be. A whole lot cheaper, a whole lot better if we send a literacy corps, and if we send a teachers corps, and if we send a health corps, and then we won't have to send a Marine corps, and I think it's a whole lot better.
The other question
did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, the other one is simply, what are your views on the prospects for peace at this particular moment?
I think there is a good chance. It isn't a cinch. It isn't a certain, sure thing. It could fall apart. There are pitfalls, opportunities for it to go wrong. The biggest hurdle is mistrust, the mistrust that permeates so many of our dealings overseas, the same thing that exists between the Israelis and their Arab neighbors, the same thing exists between the Northern Ireland, between the Catholics and the Protestants. It's a sad, sad thing. People can't sit down and trust one another. But I see that they've crossed that threshold, and they are sitting down and talking, and they're working it out. And I have confidence that it will work. There was a time, some months ago, when hardly seemed that anybody except Oscar Arias and I thought it would even have a chance to work. But I've been talking to people on both sides. You see, they've lost 60,000 lives down there in Central America in this decade, 60,000 human lives. Now, to understand what that means, you have to compare it as a percent of the population. And if you extrapolate that number as against our population, that would mean almost 4 million American lives lost. And that's more than we've lost in all the wars that this country's participated in, Civil War, the World Wars I and II, Vietnam, the whole thing combined. So they're devastated. It's a basket case economically. And all of the woes that lie in the wake of that kind of destruction, I think, have brought both sides to the point where they're ready to make some concessions and make peace, and I surely hope that it works. I can't guarantee you that it will. Pray that it will.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My question is on the Middle East with Israel. There's been a lot of silence with, recently we've had, I think they said in the paper this morning, 167 Palestinians killed by Israelis. 147 of those were by Israeli soldiers. And yet there's silence from our Congress. Paul Finley says there's a cause for that silence, but why is there silence from Congress and from the presidency? I mean, we have people being dragged out of hospitals, a variety of things.
I'm not sure that it's quite fair to say that there is silence. George Shultz, the Secretary of State, has been to the Middle East twice in an effort to try to get some talks going, and in that I want to commend Secretary Shultz. I think he's making the right effort. Obviously, you can't make peace with anyone unless you're willing to sit down and talk with them. And I think the time has to come when we renew the spirit of Camp David and create a dialogue which must begin with a mutual recognition and acceptance of one another's right to live, and right to live in peace, and right to live free from harassment and fear behind secure borders that are internationally recognized and internationally protected. If you can get the PLO representatives to say this, yes, we say Israel's got a right to live, and you got the Israelis ready to say, yes, we'd like to give them autonomy on the West Bank, then they can sit down together and talk. And that's the task of statesmanship, getting both to that mood and that point, and I think they're just about there. I sure do hope they are. Now, I'm an optimist, you see. I've been saying I think they're about ready to that, and I've been saying over here that I think possibly these things are going to work out in Central America. Well, I'll tell you why. If I didn't have the faith to believe in those things, I just think I'd go nuts, you know. I've got to believe that it's possible to work things out. That's what America's all about. We're an optimistic country. And as long as we are, and as long as we believe we can do things, I think we can do them.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Time for one more?
Time for one more.
Mr. Speaker, Congress is being increasingly criticized as an institution in gridlock. What can you do, or what are you doing as Speaker of the House to make Congress a more effective legislative body? Take, for example, your own comment this morning, 3 years to get a trade bill through Congress that you said that you believe is very important.
Well, Congress has always been criticized. You know, from the very beginning. There was a speaker back in the 1920s named Nicholas Longworth who said, every freeborn humorist in America thinks it's his responsibility to make light of Congress. And I guess that's probably true. Will Rogers said we don't have any native criminal class in the United States except perhaps Congress. I mean, this is just the way it goes. We have been criticized from the beginning, which is not to say that we're the most efficient organization in the world. We're not. The most efficient organization in the world is probably a dictatorship. You know, I mean, one guy says we do it, do it. We've got 400 in the House. We've got 435, and in the Senate we've got 100 opinionated individualists. Right. And so you got to find a consensus and work it together. But that preserves and protects our freedoms. I wouldn't want a one-man rule. I wouldn't want a situation where I, as Speaker, could just crack the whip and say we're going to do this, we can do this, and do that. Might be convenient for me, but you know, that's not the way it runs in this country. And so far as that's concerned, we have done a great many things. We're not in gridlock. Don't get any idea we're in gridlock. This year we passed the budget resolution earlier than we've ever passed it. And your Congressman, Jim Slattery, was partly responsible for that. This year we're going to pass individual appropriations bill, and we're going to start earlier than we ever have. And by the 1st of August, when we go out on August recess, I hope and believe that we will have passed every appropriation bill in the House. I can't speak for the Senate. It has its own rules, and it's a different operation, and its traditions are somewhat different. It is a more deliberative, slower operating body. We passed the bill 3 years ago in the House. The Senate didn't take it up. At that time, we were in somewhat of a gridlock because the House was in the hands of one political party and the Senate in the hands of the other. Today, they're in the hands of the same political party. We have passed a clean water bill last year, and we made it work. It was vetoed, and we overrode the veto. That's not gridlock. It's making things happen. Passed a highway bill last year. It was vetoed, overrode the veto. It's not gridlock. That's making things happen. Last year, for the first time, we passed a housing bill, and the President signed it. First time in this decade that we've provided any help to try to make housing affordable for the average family. I don't say that's gridlock. I don't think you'd say that's gridlock. We did something for the homeless last year. We passed legislation that would make it possible for people who have no place to lay their heads to at least to have a clean, warm place so that they don't freeze to death in the wintertime. And I think that's what a rich, warm, wonderful country like ours would do. I don't think that adds up to gridlock. I really think we have an effective organization which, with all its flaws and mortal imperfections, still is, just as it was in Lincoln's time, and may it ever remain the last best hope of earth. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. Great job. Great job. Thank you. Thanks so much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for coming. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Great job. Very nice. Thank you so very much. Impressed.
Ladies and gentlemen, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Jim Wright, and we have about 20 minutes.
Well, I've already made a speech, so start out. You got any of the right questions to my answers.
You say it took you 3 years to hammer out this trade bill, and I'm not that familiar with the specifics of it. Could you give me some more specifics of it, please?
Well, I just spent about 25 minutes in there.
Is it the fair trade, free safe plane, that sort of thing?
Well, I break it down into three fundamental things. One is that it provides a new set of rules that require reciprocity. It's free trade, but it's fair trade. It makes for an even playing field. It says that other countries must treat our goods the way we treat their goods. So that is not protectionism. It is just reverse, as a matter of fact. It is an incentive for other countries to abandon the protectionism that some of them currently practice against American goods. It's not to shut out foreign goods from our markets, it's to open up foreign markets to our goods. And that fundamentally explains the section I was dealing with, rules. There is part of it that I describe as tools, and that helps us to strengthen our foreign service in such a way that at every one of our embassies there are trade specialists whose job it is to help Americans try to market their goods on those foreign markets. Go over there, try to give them every break, and take them to hand and lead them through the labyrinth of red tape and so forth so that they can get the thing done. It has a technological office whose job it is to try to encourage more technological discovery and more improvements in products, and then help even small companies that discover these improvements to get them marketed. It provides the Export-Import Bank with funds to loan. And then in the question of schools, it provides an opportunity for people who have been thrown out of work because of imports to get job retraining in order that they may qualify for jobs that exist rather than just finding themselves surfaced on the market when the jobs for which they had been trained no longer and it provides $900 million for a job retraining. It does a number of things of that kind, provides help for replenishing the skilled labor pool in this country, which is probably as important a factor as anything could be. You see, the average age of a journeyman machinist in the United States today is 55 years. And an average, the average for a journeyman tool and die maker is 57 years. So what we're trying to do is to replenish our supply of skilled work people in the workforce, upgrade the work skills. Those are some of the things that it does. You know, it's an intensely complex piece of legislation. It's almost 1,000 pages long.
Mr. Speaker, your participation in the Central American peace plan created some controversy. Do you see any immediate role for you in the continuing negotiations?
Well, I didn't invite myself again in the first place. I was invited by President Reagan and requested by Secretary Schultz and Carlucci and Howard Baker to join the President in trying to put together a peace plan and encouraging Central American governments to embrace it. I did that. Some of my colleagues said, well, Jim, you're walking into a trap. I'm going to leave you high and dry. They're just going to pull the rug out from under you because they're not planning to succeed. And I said, well, I have more faith in them than that. I believe the President. He says he wants peace in Central America. I think it's time, and I want to help him if he asks me, and he did. So I did. And then just a few days after Mr. Reagan and I announced that plan, they met in Guatemala. I believed that all along that there was a good chance with a little encouragement that they could come together with a peace plan, because I've been talking with Arias, and been talking with Napoleon Wright, I've been talking with others down there. And they did. So what I did was at the invitation of the White House. The White House sent conference around to talk to me, and they came and wanted to talk to me, and I said, well, of course, I knew a lot of those people years back. I've been going to Central America for 30 years, and speak some Spanish, and able to communicate with them, have a lot of friends. I love those people. I like those people. I think they're gracious, warm, wonderful people that have been, they deserve better than they've been given in life. And so when the conference came to talk with me, Alfredo Cesar, graduate University of Texas, old school, Highland. I used to talk with him. And Alfonso Robledo came by. I had met Alfonso Robledo in 1979, right after the revolution that deposed Somoza. Known him for all those years. Said to talk with him. And then Ortega came up here, and their ambassador said, well, you talk with Ortega? And I said, well, sure, I'll talk with him too. I'd been talking to the ambassador. Bob Michael, the Republican leader, and I called the ambassador in before I got involved in the thing, even with President Dasby, because I wanted to find out what they were prepared to do. I said, will you folks give any thought to being able to agree to leave your neighbors alone now and not try to destabilize their governments? And would you be willing to get rid of the Soviet... Those were the descriptions they gave. So armed with that, I believed it was going to happen, and it did. And then Ortega came and wanted to talk, and the White House wouldn't see him. I think that's a kind of a mistake, really. You know, see, we have diplomatic relations with this country. We maintain diplomatic relations, and when they come and want to talk, I think we have the responsibility to sit and talk. Somebody in the State Department, you can't make peace with somebody if you don't talk to him. When I told Secretary Schultz that Ortega was coming and wanted to talk to me, that I'd given him an appointment. He was going to come in. Schultz said, well, will you tell me what he said? And I said, well, of course I will, which I did. And then I was called by the papal nuncio asking if I would go down to the Papal Nuncio's residence on Massachusetts Avenue and meet with Cardinal Obando y Bravo. I had suggested that he would be an ideal person to kind of be a mediator because he's respected on both sides. He's one of the few people in Nicaragua who is respected on both sides. And he had called and asked if the Papal Nuncio would ask if I'd come and see him. Well, of course I went down to see him. I don't see anything wrong. Mr. Reagan meets with Gorbachev. He's a communist. You know, I mean, anybody says he meets with the Red Chinese, and I don't fault him for that. I think he should, of course. You've got to try to make peace in the world. But you can't make peace with somebody unless you talk with him, you know. And so I did, and there was criticism from Elliott Abrams because I went and talked. But I told George Shultz I was going. He knew I was going. And I told him what had happened and what was said. And we prevailed upon the Cardinal to take a hand in it. And I thought that was a good public service. And I'd do it again. I don't really apologize to anybody. It came as a great shock to me when Elliott called and leaked that criticism to Goshko of the Washington Post, and it was Abrams who did it, and he hid in anonymity, and he shouldn't have done that. Elliott ought to treat people better than that. I wouldn't do him that way. And so, you know, I'm going to keep on doing what I can when I'm invited. When people invite me and ask me to come and talk with them, I'll come and talk with them. And I think we make a mistake when we stand in such lofty disdain and say that we won't see so-and-so because we don't approve of that person. Well, heck, you know, who are we? That gives them the impression that we think of them as inferiors, you see, that we can pick and choose just which governor we would see when they come to our country. Well, I don't feel that way. I think we